At age 49, when looking back on the path he's traveled, Tony Gonzalez stands before the public as an almost flawless monument of the NFL, a man who rewrote the entire definition of the tight end position with rare endurance and cold perfection. Over 17 seasons, he played in 270 games, caught 1,325 passes, amassed a total of 15,127 yards, and scored 111 touchdowns, numbers that once far exceeded every old standard and forced the entire league to adjust its defensive schemes. He was selected to the Pro Bowl 14 times, honored as All-Pro 10 times, featured on the NFL All-Decade team, and shortly after retirement, stepped straight into the Pro Football Hall of Fame on his first eligible ballot, a privilege reserved only for truly indisputable legends. In the colors of the Kansas City Chiefs and then the Atlanta Falcons, Tony Gonzalez was not just a reliable passing target. He was a tactical cornerstone, a professional standard, someone coaches trusted absolutely, and young players used as the model to emulate. He was one of the rare tight ends who combined the power of a lineman with the refined receiving skills of a wide receiver, turning the position from a supporting role into the center of many modern offensive systems. But as the glow of those numbers fades and the roar of the crowds becomes only memory, a stark truth slowly emerges. Behind every catch was a collision etched deep into joints. Behind every season were mornings waking to nagging pain that no trophy could soothe. His body still stands tall, his walk still steady in the eyes of outsiders, but inside is the history of thousands of moments of silent endurance, where fatigue was not allowed to exist and weakness had no place. Tony Gonzalez lived his entire career on iron will, on ruthless self-discipline, playing not only to beat opponents, but also to avoid being replaced, forgotten, or returned to the invisibility he once feared. When the field is gone, when the collisions have stopped, the only question left hanging in the cold silence is, when the one thing that ever made you visible disappears, what do you have left to keep standing? No legend in this moment, no glory to lean on, just a man after the final game, carrying pain no one needs to witness, and a will forged so hard that even silence cannot break it. If the story of Tony Gonzalez makes you pause and think, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue into deeper chapters together, where glory no longer hides the truth. Tony Gonzalez's childhood did not begin with brutal collisions or loud upheavals, but with a quiet, cruel disappearance when his biological father left, while Tony was too young to understand what had happened. There was no explanation for that child, no conversation, no promise to return, not even a clear enough goodbye for Tony to know he had been left behind. The man who gave him his blood simply walked out of his life, leaving behind a shapeless but heavy void that followed Tony for decades. No one told the boy it wasn't his fault, that some people leave because of their own weakness, not because of the child who stays. And because no one said it, Tony drew his own conclusion. If a father could abandon his son without looking back, then he must not have been enough to be chosen to stay. He grew up without material lack, with a loving mother and a stepfather trying to fill the role, but their presence could not replace what was lost. Some voids cannot be filled by care. They simply exist as a quiet dent in the soul. Tony was never taught how to be a son to a father, never experienced the feeling of someone standing in the stands just to watch him, not for achievements, not for wins, but simply because he was their child. At family gatherings, there was always an empty chair no one mentioned. On birthdays, a wish that never came. In childhood games, when Tony was still a skinny boy trying his hardest to run faster, jump higher, his eyes would unconsciously scan the stands, searching for a familiar face before dropping again, when he realized he was hoping for something that didn't exist. Each time, Tony didn't cry, didn't question, didn't rebel. He learned to stay silent and remember. He learned that expecting is a risk, that hope can hurt the deepest. It was in that silence that a child was forced to grow up too soon, building himself a tough shell to hide the emptiness inside. Tony was not taught that weakness can be expressed, that hurt can be shared, that a boy doesn't need to become exceptional to deserve love. Instead, he taught himself that he had to be stronger, better, more outstanding, so he would never be abandoned again. Every small disappointment in life quietly carved that belief deeper. His presence always had to be proven, and if he wasn't good enough, he would disappear from others' eyes the way his father had disappeared from his life. Sports entered Tony's childhood not as a romantic dream, but as a safe refuge where rules were clearer than emotions, where effort was rewarded with concrete results, where his existence could not be ignored. On the field, Tony was seen in a way life outside had never provided. Every catch, every score gave him something close to recognition, a feeling that, at least here, his presence mattered. But at the same time, a dangerous loop began to form, as Tony gradually tied his self-worth to performance, to output, to never being allowed to weaken even once. He learned to bury emotions deep inside, learned to let his body carry everything his soul didn't know how to voice. The original tragedy of Tony Gonzalez was not poverty or lack of opportunity, but the persistent feeling that he had not been chosen, that his father's departure was not a passing event, but a quiet mark etched into his childhood. That feeling didn't explode into resentment. It silently transformed into fear of being forgotten, an obsession with always standing firm, always being present, always being good enough to never be left again. It followed him into every decision, every sprint, every collision later on, making Tony willing to pay with his body, with exhaustion, with loneliness itself, just to never stand before an empty stand like the boy once did, who learned life's most painful lesson very early. The deepest tragedy is not losing someone, but growing up with the feeling that you were never enough to be kept. When moving through those early years full of voids, Tony Gonzalez did not turn to sports for pure joy or a romantic dream of victory, but because it was the only place in his young life that did not turn its back on him. Sports didn't disappear. It was there every day, repeating, patient, cold but fair, giving Tony a clear frame of reference that family life had never offered. On the practice field, no one asked whose son he was. No one cared about the gaps at home or the empty chairs in the stands. Everything was decided by one single question. Do you have enough effort? And Tony clung to that question like a lifeline. He didn't run because he loved running, didn't train because he enjoyed pain. He did it because every practice ending in exhaustion was quiet proof that he was still here, still not eliminated, still had a reason to exist in this world. Discipline gradually became the only language Tony knew to use to speak with life. A language that needed no emotion, no explanation, only repetition long enough that no one could deny his presence. While other children sought recognition in parental praise, Tony found it in every drop of sweat hitting the gym floor, in every trembling muscle that still forced itself to stand straight. He learned to arrive earlier than others, leave later than others, not because anyone demanded it, but because he feared that slowing down even one beat would mean being abandoned again, like before. That fear was not loud, not dramatic. It quietly seeped into every habit, turning discipline from a tool into a matter of survival. Tony allowed himself no missed practices, no complaints of fatigue, no visible weakness, because deep down, he believed weakness was exactly why people leave. Over time, emotions were compressed so tightly that Tony nearly forgot how to name them. Every hurt, worry, fear was shoved down into the body, so the body could carry what the soul didn't know how to say. Each practice became a ritual of self-reassurance, a silent affirmation that, if he was diligent enough, enduring enough, irreplaceable enough, then this world would not abandon him again. But the price of that persistence was never calculated immediately. It accumulated day by day, month by month, year by year, as Tony learned to ignore signals of fatigue, treat pain as natural, and see endurance as the measure of dignity. Discipline didn't bring him peace. It only brought control, a fragile feeling that if he kept everything in line, he wouldn't be pulled back into the helplessness of that boy long ago. In Tony's world, rest meant danger. Slowing down meant falling behind, and falling behind meant becoming invisible. So he kept pushing himself forward, kept using his body as a shield against fears that were never named. No one taught Tony that discipline could coexist with gentleness, that strength doesn't have to be built on self-punishment. He only knew that discipline was the only thing that had never left him, the only thing that responded honestly to his effort, and so he stayed loyal to it to the point of cruelty. It was in that process that Tony gradually became a person admired for extraordinary work ethic, but also a person increasingly estranged from his own emotions. Discipline helped him stand firm in a harsh world, helped him advance step by step with certainty, but it didn't heal the old cracks, didn't fill the void formed in early childhood. It only guaranteed one thing: he would not collapse right away. And in those years, that was enough for Tony Gonzalez to keep surviving, keep walking, keep proving, even though deep inside, he never stopped fearing that if he stopped, everything he had struggled to build would vanish, just as his father had once vanished from his life. When stepping foot into UC Berkeley, Tony Gonzalez didn't carry the romantic college dream like so many others. He carried a habit already etched deep into his bones. He wasn't allowed to stop. In an environment where talent converged and competition showed no mercy, Tony quickly proved himself a rare phenomenon, capable of conquering two seemingly irreconcilable worlds at the same time: basketball and football. On the basketball court, he possessed the explosiveness, movement, and spatial awareness of an elite athlete. On the football field, he brought the toughness, discipline, and endurance forged from the years before. Success came early, came fast, and came all at once. But the dangerous part was that Tony didn't see any of it as a sign to slow down. On the contrary, every compliment, every playing opportunity, every moment of being seen became further proof that he had to keep pushing himself even harder, as if easing up even for a beat would make everything collapse. At Berkeley, Tony learned how to win in multiple arenas, but he never learned how to rest in any of them. His body became a multi-purpose tool used relentlessly, pushed to its absolute limits, rarely treated as a refuge that needed protection. Overlapping training days, back-to-back competitions, long exhausting nights left unnamed, they accumulated into a rhythm of life with no pauses. Tony didn't ask his body if it was okay, because he had long since learned that question didn't bring useful answers. Instead, he taught himself to ignore the smallest warning signals: a fleeting pain, a throbbing knee joint, a shoulder staying tight longer than usual. Every sign got filed in the same drawer as weakness, and weakness wasn't permitted to exist in the world Tony was fighting to hold on to. Dual success at Berkeley wasn't a liberating peak. It was the opening of a longer chain of endurance, where he tied his value ever more tightly to non-stop performance. To others, it was the image of a rare, complete, admirable athlete. In Tony's private reality, it was the beginning of an invisible prison, where he locked himself into a brutal schedule of his own making. His body was no longer a place to return to after a long day. It was a machine that had to keep running, had to keep delivering, had to keep proving. No major incident exploded at Berkeley. No fateful injury forced Tony to stop and reflect. Instead, there was a steady, quiet series of small erosions, like water seeping into stone. Every practice that ran longer than planned, every game played without full recovery, every decision to aim higher than necessary added another layer of fatigue Tony refused to acknowledge. He began to get used to living in constant tension, where muscles were rarely relaxed and the mind was rarely at peace. The rare moments without movement made him restless, as if stillness was a threat, as if only when his body ached could he be sure he was still doing what needed to be done. At Berkeley, Tony also began experiencing a paradox that would follow him for life. The more successful he became, the further he drifted from any sense of safety. Every step forward brought new pressure, a new standard, a new fear that if he couldn't sustain that intensity, he would lose everything he had just gained. So he kept using his body as a tool to soothe the fear, to keep distance from questions he didn't want to answer, to postpone facing the truth that no one can run forever without paying a price. Berkeley became the place where Tony learned to win on multiple fronts, but also where he perfected his most dangerous habit, treating endurance as the normal state, treating pain as the foundation of his self-worth. The quiet chain of pain began there. No explosion needed to record it, no dramatic event to justify it. It only needed time, and Tony was ready to give it more than anyone else. When he left Berkeley, he carried the reputation of an outstanding athlete with limitless potential, but he also carried a body already accustomed to being pushed to the edge, a mind trained to stay silent in the face of any stop signal. The tragedy of this phase wasn't in one specific fall, it was in the fact that Tony never learned how to step down, never allowed himself to believe his existence was measured by anything other than the ability to keep enduring. And from here, the path to harsher years ahead was paved with small, accumulated, quiet, but irreversible choices. The day Tony Gonzalez entered the NFL draft, there was no moment that felt like liberation. No fireworks, no sense of having arrived, just another door opening, colder, harsher, and allowing no one to walk through with the illusion that they were welcome. Tony Gonzalez understood that clearly from the very first days. The NFL wasn't a place to prove you had talent. It was a place that relentlessly asked one single question, over and over to the point of cruelty. Are you still useful today? Here, pain wasn't an event, it was the standard. Fatigue wasn't a warning signal, it was the default state. And rest wasn't considered a right, it was a sign of falling behind. Tony stepped into this league with a body already accustomed to endurance, a mind trained not to ask too much, and a quiet but profound fear deeper than all the rest. If he slowed down, he would be replaced. That fear wasn't anything new, it just changed shape. From the childhood fear of being abandoned, it became the fear of being discarded in an environment where people were measured by daily performance. In the NFL, every practice was a tryout, every game an evaluation with no right to appeal. No one cared what you did yesterday, how much you had sacrificed, or what damage your body was carrying. The only thing that mattered was whether you were still creating value. And Tony, who had learned to survive by never allowing himself to disappear, quickly adapted to that rule in the only way he knew, by pushing himself even harder. He arrived at practice early, left late, trained as if every day was the last of his career, not out of pure passion, but because he didn't dare believe he could be safe if he didn't. In the locker room, among the massive, scarred, aching bodies, Tony realized a cold truth. Here, weakness wasn't hated, it was ignored. And being ignored in the NFL meant disappearing soon enough? No weakness allowed, because weakness wouldn't be waited for. No rest allowed, because rest would be read as no longer necessary. Practices stretched through soreness, games where every hit reminded him the body wasn't his own anymore. All of it gradually became the familiar rhythm of life. Tony didn't resist that rhythm, because deep down it resembled what he had lived with for so long. A world where value had to be proven continuously, where existence was never taken for granted. Tony's NFL career didn't begin with the feeling of being chosen. It began with the feeling that he had to choose himself every single day, had to prove he deserved one more practice, One more game, one more contract. His body started carrying demands far beyond normal limits, but his mind wouldn't let him stop to listen. Every pain was treated as a fee that had to be paid, every bruise as confirmation he was still in the game. Tony understood that in the NFL, no one gets shoved out with a hard push. People get phased out with silence, with no longer being called, no longer being planned for. That's why he did everything to avoid that silence. He learned to play smarter, more precisely, exploiting the tiniest gaps to become indispensable. But alongside the skill improvement came a tightening spiral of exhaustion. No real time to recover, no space to admit he was running low. Tony began to get used to living in perpetual tension, where every passing day was measured by whether he was still fast enough, strong enough, durable enough. In the NFL, the fear never went away. It just changed how it showed up. And for Tony, that fear became the main engine, keeping him in place, but also slowly draining the last soft parts of the man he was. His career didn't start with the belief that he would be great. It started with the obsession that he couldn't afford to become expendable. It was a fragile but stubborn foundation, strong enough to carry him through those first years in the planet's harshest league, but also strong enough to guarantee that the price wouldn't come all at once. It would accumulate, quietly, waiting until Tony no longer had the strength to pretend he couldn't hear his body begging to stop. As the first years in the NFL passed, and Tony Gonzalez not only survived but rose above, one thing gradually became clear to the entire league. He wasn't simply a great tight end. He was changing the way people understood the position itself. Before Tony, the tight end was typically seen as a supporting piece, a quiet bridge between the offensive line and the receiver's important but rarely the center. With Tony Gonzalez, that concept was completely shattered. He ran routes like a wide receiver, caught the ball with rare precision and softness, yet still possessed the power to go head-to-head with the biggest linebackers and safeties. With each passing season, his role in offensive schemes expanded until targeting Tony was no longer an option, it became a necessity. Defenses were forced to adjust, coaches were forced to rethink, and the next generation of tight ends was forced to measure themselves against the shadow he cast. Tony Gonzalez became the new standard, and that standard was quickly celebrated. Awards, praise, mentions, as the ideal model began to surround him. But right from that moment, a cruel paradox took shape. When you become the benchmark, you're no longer allowed to be an ordinary human being. Tony no longer had the right to be tired, because a benchmark isn't permitted to falter. He no longer had the right to be wrong, because an icon isn't permitted to miss a beat. Every time he stepped on the field, he didn't just represent himself, he represented an entirely new definition that people had pinned on him. The praise came with an invisible cage, where Tony was framed in the image of absolute reliability, unflagging performance, a body seemingly immune to fatigue and time. No one asked if he was okay, because that question seemed unnecessary for someone considered always okay. In the locker room, Tony began to realize that the silence directed at him was different from the silence of his early years. As a child, he was silent because no one asked. As an icon, he was silent because no one thought they needed to ask. Encouragement slowly turned into expectation. Nods of trust slowly turned into pressure to maintain. His body kept performing at the highest level, but his mind had less and less room to breathe. Tony learned to hide fatigue behind a calm smile, learned to turn pain into routine, and learned to keep moving forward even as small cracks began appearing inside. No one saw the mornings he woke up with stiff knees, the evenings he came home with his body still vibrating from hits, or the rare moments he wondered whether he was still Tony Gonzalez or just the version everyone expected him to be. The tragedy of becoming the standard lies in the fact that the standard is never allowed to fall below itself. Each passing season, Tony didn't just face opponents on the field, he faced the perfect version of himself from the previous season. Every comparison worked against him because his past was always outstanding. And so every sign of decline, no matter how small, got magnified into questions about regression, about age, about whether he still deserved the spot he held. Tony felt those looks not as open criticism, but as a simmering pressure that seeped into every practice, every game. He didn't allow himself to complain, because complaining meant admitting he no longer matched the image built around him. Instead, he kept using discipline to patch the cracks, kept using perfect preparation to hide the limits slowly emerging. But discipline, as he had learned early on, doesn't heal. It only maintains order in a system that's growing rigid. His body kept functioning, but not as fluidly as before. His mind stayed focused, but no longer light. And amid the non-stop praise, Tony began to lose something very hard to name: the feeling of being himself without having to prove it. He became the person everyone trusted absolutely, but few truly understood. Conversations revolved around schemes, stats, records, while questions about emotions, about fatigue, about the inner unsteadiness almost never came up. An icon doesn't need comforting. That was the unspoken assumption the world placed on Tony Gonzalez. And he, so accustomed to existing in silence, accepted that assumption without resistance. The tragedy of this phase wasn't that Tony was treated badly, it was that he was treated too perfectly. That perfection left no room for weakness, no allowance for off days, no space to admit that even icons are human. Tony kept playing, kept hitting new milestones, kept solidifying his place in NFL history, but every step forward left another piece of the man behind. He became more outstanding as a tight end, but also drifted further from the old sense of safety when sports was once the place that didn't abandon him. Now, sports itself had become the place demanding more than he could give, and Tony Gonzalez, in his familiar calm, kept meeting the demand because he had never learned how to do otherwise. No one asked if he was okay, because the world believed someone like him was always okay. And it was within that belief that the tragedy of the standard quietly took full shape, not with a bang, but with the slow erosion of a man too accustomed to carrying everything alone. The years when Tony Gonzalez entered the most brilliant phase of his career were also when the gap between the spotlight and his private life grew so wide it could no longer be bridged. Tony Gonzalez was called to the Pro Bowl time after time, honored as All-Pro, mentioned in debates about the greatest tight end in history, and every new record only reinforced the image of an almost perfect career. On the field, Tony was the icon of cold consistency, showing up every Sunday with performance that barely varied, as if time never touched him. But behind that consistency was a life rhythm that narrowed more and more, where anything not serving football got pushed to the margins. Tony's success demanded total presence not just on the field, but in every decision, every schedule, every priority. And in that process, family didn't break apart through big fights. It cracked through prolonged absence. His closest relationships gradually had to compete with practices, road trips, seasons that rolled on without clear stopping points. Tony didn't intend to drift away from anyone, but he also didn't have the capacity to stay in the way those around him needed. There were late nights coming home, postponed dates, promises made in good faith but never fully kept, and slowly the patience of those around him wore thin in a way eerily similar to the silence he had once witnessed in childhood. Tony began to get used to losing people not through big shocks, but through gaps that appeared gradually, calls that grew fewer, conversations that shortened, eyes that no longer waited. And in a bitter paradox, that feeling wasn't unfamiliar. It resembled what the boy long ago had gone through when someone important vanished without explanation. The only difference, this time, Tony was the one leaving. Not because he wanted to abandon anyone, but because the rhythm of life he had chosen didn't allow him to stay. The higher the success, the denser the schedule, and with each passing day, he had less time to pause and realize what he was trading away. Tony's romantic relationships struggled to exist alongside a man always in ready mode for the next game. The absolute focus football demanded left little room for vulnerability, for slow conversations, for full presence. He brought home an exhausted body, a mind still on the field, and silence gradually became the only bridge between him and those closest to him. No one could blame him, because Tony's success was something society celebrated, media glorified, seen as proof of tireless dedication. But that very praise made his private losses invisible. There was no room for complaint when you're called a role model, no space to admit loneliness when everyone believes you're living the dream. Tony kept playing, kept breaking records, kept being named in honors, but each time he returned home, he faced a clearer truth. The most important people in his life couldn't wait forever. There were moments Tony realized he was replaying an old loop, the loop he had once hated bitterly in childhood memories. As a child, he was the one left behind, staring at the void his father left. Now, as a successful man, he was the one creating that void in others' lives. The realization didn't hit like a blow. It settled as a heavy feeling that followed him every time he left home for practice, every time he prioritized a strategy meeting over a family evening, every time he told himself things would be fine after this season. But this season always led to the next, and the promise of later slowly became a self-soothing habit. Tony didn't deliberately choose loneliness, but he chose the path that led to it, step by small step, decision by seemingly reasonable short-term decision that proved ruthless in the long run. His success was built on consistency, but that very consistency left no room for fragile things. Relationships that couldn't withstand his rhythm didn't fail from lack of love. They failed from lack of time and presence. And Tony, who had learned endurance so early, continued to endure this loss in the familiar way, silence and moving forward. He didn't allow himself to stop and truly grieve, because stopping meant admitting there were things success couldn't compensate for. Instead, he let the loneliness settle like a new layer of sediment, piling onto old layers never processed. Every Pro Bowl, every All-Pro, every historic milestone became a new shell, covering the reality that his private life was shrinking more and more. And in the bitter repetition of fate, Tony Gonzalez once again stood on the familiar side of the story of loss. Only this time, he was no longer the helpless child waiting, but a man with full power to choose, who had chosen a path where presence always had to be traded away. The higher the success, the deeper the loneliness, and Tony gradually grew accustomed to that feeling as an inseparable part of the price he paid to keep standing at the peak he had climbed with everything he had. At a point that Tony Gonzalez couldn't pinpoint clearly by any specific season or game, his body began sending signals that discipline could no longer fully cover up. Tony Gonzalez had long been accustomed to pain, accustomed to the point of treating it as background noise in life, something that existed to be ignored. But then the pain refused to accept that secondary role anymore. It lingered longer after each game, grew more persistent after each practice, and appeared even in the most seemingly harmless moments. Knees that once exploded with power now creaked with every rise from a chair. Shoulders that had absorbed hundreds of collisions began aching without clear reason. His spine, which had carried an entire career, grew stiff every morning, as if reminding him that no debt is ever forgotten forever. Arthritis didn't arrive as an event. It arrived as a slow, steady truth, seeping into every small movement, every seemingly unconscious habit. Waking up each morning became a silent negotiation, where Tony had to assess what he could do today without paying too high a price. There were mornings he sat on the edge of the bed longer than usual, not out of laziness, but because his body needed a few extra minutes to agree to keep going. That feeling was foreign and terrifying to a man who had spent his life believing that if he pushed hard enough, his body would obey. For the first time, Tony realized discipline was no longer an absolute tool. It still kept him standing, but it could no longer force the pain into silence like before. Recovery sessions, extended stretching, hours in the training room gradually took center stage in his schedule. Yoga and meditation, once seen as foreign in the violent world of the NFL, became mandatory needs. Not because he wanted spiritual balance, but because without them, his body would refuse to cooperate. Each yoga pose was no longer just an exercise, it was a negotiation, where Tony had to listen to every new limit that emerged. Meditation didn't bring complete peace, but it helped him recognize the depth of fatigue he had ignored for so long. Recovery was no longer an accessory to training. It became the prerequisite for surviving one more day in this brutal league. The most painful part wasn't the physical sensation. It was the role reversal. The body that had once been a loyal ally, that had met every demand, that had helped him outrun the fear of abandonment, now began setting limits. It no longer said yes. Every time Tony asked for more, it started saying enough through pains he couldn't ignore. For someone who had built his entire identity on endurance, that resistance felt like betrayal. Tony didn't get angry, didn't resent, he just felt confused. He didn't know how to dialogue with his body in any way other than continuing to demand more endurance. But the more he did, the higher the price climbed. Sleepless nights from soreness became more frequent. Warm-ups stretched longer than the actual practice. And in the rare moments without movement, a new fear appeared. The fear that if he stopped, his body might not let him come back the way it used to. Tony began to understand that this was no longer the phase of proving how much he could endure, it was the phase of learning how not to destroy what remained. But that lesson ran counter to every instinct that had nurtured him since childhood. Listening to his body meant accepting there were days he couldn't be perfect, that some limits couldn't be overcome by will alone. And that forced Tony to confront a fear deeper than the pain itself, the fear of becoming worthless when no longer performing at the highest level. His body was no longer a tool to evade emotions. It became a warning, forcing him to look straight at the reality that no one can run like a machine forever. Every recovery session, every treatment, every decision to rest, was no longer a sign of weakness. It was a desperate effort to extend a career built on the foundation of endurance. Tony still played, still competed, still maintained enough performance to avoid being replaced. But behind that consistency was a complex pain management process no fan ever saw. He learned to plan for the pain, predict where and when it would strike, and how to keep it from showing. But each time, he also learned something unwanted. The body can't be commanded forever. It remembers every debt, and it will collect whether sooner or later. The body's betrayal didn't come to punish Tony. It came to remind him of the limits he had refused to acknowledge his entire life. And in the silence of those aching mornings, Tony Gonzalez began to understand that the hardest battle was no longer on the field. It was happening inside his own body, where discipline was no longer enough to win, and listening became something he was forced to learn, even if it was too late to do it gently. There are pains that don't come from hits on the field, don't come from lingering aches in the joints, but from the moment a man is forced to look straight at himself in the very role he once swore he would never repeat. For Tony Gonzalez, that was the moment he became a father. Not the first time he held his child, not when he heard the first cry, but in the very ordinary, very quiet moments, when he looked into his child's eyes and suddenly recognized a painfully familiar image, a child waiting. Tony once believed he understood the pain of father absence, that those childhood memories were enough to keep him from repeating the old path. But life doesn't repeat tragedy through identical details, it repeats through emotions, and the emotion of absence doesn't need the same cause to inflict harm. Tony had children, but there were periods when he wasn't there in the way a child needs, not because he didn't love them, but because he was accustomed to putting duty above presence. accustomed to believing that today's sacrifice would bring something better tomorrow. Long road trips, back-to-back seasons, practices that couldn't be skipped, all justified by a better future. But that future always stayed ahead, while the present quietly slipped away. There were years that couldn't be reclaimed, evenings that couldn't be relived, first moments in his children's lives that existed only in others' memories. Tony didn't leave the way his biological father had. He was still present in name, still provided, still cared in the way of a busy man. But to a child, the difference between completely absent and partially absent is sometimes not as vast as adults think. The waiting still exists. The longing is still there. And the disappointment, if any, forms quietly in ways that need no words. Tony began to realize this not through accusations, but through tiny details. A slower glance when he left, an innocent question about whether he'd be home tonight, a longer silence after promises of next time. Those details awakened memories he thought he had under control. The memories of the boy who once scanned the stands for a father and saw only empty seats. This time, the empty seat wasn't outside, it was inside him. The realization didn't come with thunder. It came with the familiar cold feeling of being placed in the position he had hated most. Tony had once resented his father for not staying, for not choosing family, for letting a child grow up with unanswered questions. And now he had to face a much harder truth. He never wanted to become that father, but through very reasonable choices society applauded, he was walking a similar path. What made this tragedy so profound wasn't the similarity in behavior. It was the similarity in the feeling it created for the children left behind. Tony couldn't blame his career because he had chosen to pursue it with everything he had. He couldn't blame circumstances because he had enough power to adjust if he truly wanted, and that made the guilt heavier. This wasn't a tragedy of helplessness. It was a tragedy of conscious trade-offs. There were nights Tony lay awake, body aching after a game, but the physical pain didn't trouble him as much as one haunting thought. Were his children growing up, feeling they had to be strong too soon, just like he once did? Were the voids he left quietly shaping them the way he had once been shaped? Tony began looking back at himself, not as a player, but as a father trying to understand the cost of choices he once took for granted. He realized presence can't be compensated by success, that no trophy can replace an evening at home, a slow conversation, or the security of knowing someone is always there. But realizing doesn't mean being able to fix everything. The years that passed can't return. The missed moments can't be recreated. And Tony had to live with the truth that even if he changed starting today, some voids would forever exist in his children's memories. The only thing he could do was stop repeating the mistake again. But even that effort didn't bring instant relief, because every attempt to be more present made him more aware of what he hadn't done before. Redemption, if any, didn't come as a moment of liberation. It came as a prolonged process, where every good action carried the memory of actions that never happened. The tragedy lies in the fact that Tony couldn't go back to being the boy to be comforted, nor could he go back to being the young father to start over. He could only stand in the present, carrying both roles, the child once left behind and the man terrified he would leave others behind. When Tony looked at his children, he didn't just see the future, he saw the past. He saw himself long ago, with the same waiting eyes, the same silence learned too early, the same questions never spoken aloud. And in that moment, he was forced to admit the most painful thing. I have become the father I once resented. Not because he wanted to cause harm, but because he had let career and discipline take up all the space that presence needed. That realization didn't destroy Tony, but it changed him forever. It forced him to re-examine everything he once believed was right, forced him to confront the limits of success, and forced him to accept that some victories on the field were failures in private life. The tragic heart of the story isn't that Tony Gonzalez was a bad father. It's that he was a father awake enough to recognize the voids he had created, and in enough pain to be unable to pretend those voids didn't exist. This isn't a story of complete redemption. It's the story of a man carrying guilt as his compass, trying to stay more, listen more, love more, even knowing that some years that have passed will never come back. The decision to leave Kansas City for Atlanta didn't carry the sense of liberation that many still attach to team changes. For Tony Gonzalez, it wasn't a fresh start. It was the continuation of a journey that had already stretched too long, where he was forced to ask himself what he was running from, or if he was just trying one last time. On the outside, it was framed as a hopeful new chapter, a chance to chase what was still missing in his career. On the inside, Tony knew better than anyone that his body no longer had room for romantic dreams. The pains didn't vanish when he changed jerseys. The mornings that took time for his body to agree to stand up didn't become easier just because of a new city. Atlanta didn't bring him relief. It only changed the backdrop of the endurance. Tony walked into the new locker room with the same old habits. Arrive early, practice long, stay silent, no complaints. He knew he didn't have much time left, and that very awareness made every practice feel heavier, not because the intensity was higher, but because every movement carried an unspoken question. Is this the last time? Playing at this point no longer relied on youthful enthusiasm. It relied on a will that had been hardened to the point of numbness. Tony no longer believed his body would adapt on its own. He only hoped it would hold out long enough. Each game became a loan borrowed from the future, where he traded a few hours of play for days of soreness ahead. He understood that price better than anyone, because his body no longer hit it. There were practices where he had to adjust every stride, every landing angle, not to optimize performance, but to avoid triggering the familiar pain. Atlanta welcomed Tony as a crucial piece, an experienced leader, a standard the team needed. And that very trust placed a new burden on his shoulders. No room to decline, no permission to show fatigue, no allowance for anyone to see that his presence was now sustained by effort far beyond normal limits. Tony played more with intelligence, reading situations faster, choosing positions smarter, because he could no longer rely fully on explosiveness or burst. Every decision on the field was calculated to minimize risk, but the biggest risk lay in continuing to step onto it. He wondered what he was pushing for. The championship ring he never had, the feeling of something unfinished, or the fear of facing the void after stopping. That question had no clear answer, and Tony didn't allow himself to dig deeper, because digging deeper meant admitting that time had probably already won. In the rare quiet moments, when the stadium lights were off and the noise no longer shielded him, he felt the accumulated fatigue clearly, not just in his body but in his mind. Atlanta didn't erase the losses behind him. It only extended the time for Tony to confront them. Each game's end became a check on his body, not to celebrate or regret, but to make sure he could still step onto the field one more time. There were nights he lay motionless, listening to his own breathing, wondering if continuing was truly courage or just postponing the inevitable. Tony knew that every time he played, he was spending future days in advance, days when his body would demand repayment. But he kept going, because stopping also meant fully facing the role he wasn't ready to take on. A man no longer measured by what his body could do. Atlanta became the place where Tony learned to play conservatively, conserving energy, conserving pain, conserving every remaining moment of his career. But no strategy could change the reality that time wasn't on his side. Each passing game was both a small victory over decline and a step closer to the unavoidable end. And in that hesitation, Tony Gonzalez kept stepping onto the field, not because he believed he was still unbeatable, but because he wasn't ready to let go of what had defined him for so long. Atlanta wasn't a place to escape the past, nor was it quite a place to find the future. It was the final stretch where Tony tried to take a few more steps, fully aware that each step was paid for with endurance, and each advance made the final question clearer. When there's nothing left to borrow, where will he stand? There are turning points that don't come with the crack of breaking bones or the cold white lights of an ICU. They come on an ordinary morning, so cruel in its normalcy. For Tony Gonzalez, that moment had no audience, no doctors surrounding him, no dramatic instant for people to retell, just a quiet room, a body accustomed to enduring, and a truth suddenly undeniable. He couldn't stand up. Not an explosive pain like after a hit, but a stiffness spreading through his entire body, as if every joint had quietly agreed that today they wouldn't cooperate. Tony sat on the edge of the bed, feet touching the floor, and waited. He was used to waiting for pain to ease, used to breathing deep, clenching his jaw, and forcing his body to obey. But this time, the pain didn't retreat. It didn't flare up, didn't dramatize. It just stayed, heavy and final, like a door, closing very slowly but impossible to reopen. He tried shifting, tried standing, tried leaning on the instincts that had saved him for years. Nothing. For the first time in his career, Tony couldn't use will to win a morning. That feeling wasn't like failure on the field, because on the field, failure still offered a chance to correct. Here in this silence, he understood there were limits that allowed no further negotiation. He sat there a long time, not panicking, not angry, just listening to his breathing, and realizing something that weighed on his heart. If he continued, he wouldn't just lose football. He would lose the ability to be a father, to be fully present as a human being. The thought came gently, but cut deeper than any physical pain. Tony had accepted paying with his body for years, but for the first time, that price no longer belonged only to him. It touched the children growing up, the evenings needing a father strong enough to listen, the ordinary moments he had already missed too many of. No accident to blame, no fateful instant to cling to, just a chain of accumulated choices that could no longer be reversed. He understood this wasn't a bad day. It was the logical outcome of thousands of days that had passed the same way. That truth was both cruel and liberating. Cruel because it no longer let him pretend. Liberating because it finally voiced what his body had whispered for too long. Tony didn't cry. He didn't comfort himself with empty promises that everything would be fine. He just sat there, letting the truth sink in, letting a new fear form clearer than the old ones. Before, he feared being replaced, forgotten, discarded. Now he feared something else. Becoming a man no longer strong enough to stay, fearing that if he pushed more, he would only bring home an empty shell of a body, an exhausted mind, and a half-presence. That morning didn't end with a grand announced decision, no press conference, no heroic farewell. It ended with a quiet acceptance that the path he was on had reached its end. Tony understood that continuing could bring a few more games, a few more familiar moments, but it would also take away what he was no longer willing to trade. This turning point didn't explode, didn't shock, but it changed everything irreversibly. From that moment, every thought of continuing no longer pictured the field or the stands, but similar mornings where he had to negotiate with his body to stand, and evenings where he no longer had the strength to be a full father. Tony had spent his life proving he could endure. That morning, for the first time, he accepted that endurance was no longer the sole measure of worth. The silence of that moment weighed heavier than any collision he had ever endured, because it offered no option to retreat. It offered only one way forward: stop, before everything shattered completely. And in that stillness, Tony Gonzalez understood that some battles aren't won by pushing forward, but by knowing when to let go, not out of weakness, but because he had finally learned to listen to what his body and life had been trying to tell him for a very long time. The decision to retire didn't come like a door slamming shut, but like a void opening too wide for Tony Gonzalez to know how to step into it. When he left the field, the first thing that vanished wasn't the lights or the cheers. It was the structure of life. No more minute-by-minute practice schedules. No more strategy meetings. No more clear role to fulfill each day. On the first morning after no longer being a player, Tony woke up following old habits, his body still waiting for an order, a schedule, a reason to endure. But nothing came. That silence didn't bring rest. It brought a profound disorientation. If he wasn't the one training, competing, enduring, then who was he? For years, Tony's identity had been tightly bound to overcoming pain, to continuing when others stopped, to existing in an environment with no room for weakness. When all of that was taken away at once, he faced a void very similar to the void of his childhood, where he once didn't know where he stood in anyone else's life. Back then, that void was filled by sports. Now, with sports gone, the void returned starker, because nothing shielded it anymore. Tony realized he had never learned how to exist without enduring. Every value he had ever attached to himself revolved around the ability to keep going, the ability not to quit, the ability to stand firm against pain. Retirement didn't just take the field, it took away that familiar measure of worth. There were days Tony didn't know what to do with the energy still left in his body. No one needed him to be ready anymore. No one expected him to show up on the field. No pressure to prove anything. What many people dream of became a burden. Freedom. That freedom didn't take the shape of liberation. It felt like being left in a vast room with no directions. Tony tried filling the time with other activities, but everything lacked the sense of necessity. Nothing demanded he push past limits, and that left him more confused than relieved. He began to realize that for years, enduring hadn't just been a means to success, it had become his identity. When that identity was stripped away, he didn't know what remained. Quiet afternoons stretched unnaturally long. Evenings no longer carried the anticipation of the next game. Tony faced himself more than ever before, and it wasn't comfortable. He saw again the boy from long ago, standing before unexplained voids, forced to create his own reasons to exist. Now, though no longer physically abandoned, that lost feeling returned in another form. No one needed him the way the NFL once did. The tragedy of this phase wasn't losing fame or money, it was losing the answer to the question, who am I? While playing, the answer was simple. He was the endurer, the one who didn't quit, the one always ready. In retirement, that answer dissolved, leaving a void he had never been taught to fill with gentler things. Tony understood that if he wasn't careful, this void could swallow him in a different way, not with collisions, but with emptiness. There were times he missed the old pain, not because it felt good, but because it was familiar. Pain had once given him a reason to exist, each day. Without it, he had to learn a much harder lesson, existing without needing to prove anything. The process wasn't quick, nor was it gentle. It forced Tony to look back over his entire life, not through the lens of achievements, but through the lens of relationships, choices, repeating voids. Retirement became a mirror, reflecting everything he had once escaped through practices and games. He could no longer hide in the gym or on the field whenever emotions grew uncomfortable. For the first time, Tony had to stay with himself without a role to shield him. The tragedy of someone who only knows who he is while enduring lies in this. When there's nothing left to endure, they must rebuild identity from scratch, slowly and painfully, in a different way. For Tony Gonzalez, retirement wasn't the end of a career. It was the beginning of the deepest confrontation, learning to exist without needing pain to know he was alive. After retirement, Tony Gonzalez didn't step into a clearer new chapter of life. He stood still amid what couldn't be undone. There was no undo button for the years that had passed, no way to return the missed evenings, the late hugs, the child's questions left hanging because of practice schedules and flights. Tony became a late father not because his children came late, but because his full presence arrived late, and that lateness carried no certain promise of forgiveness. He understood that clearly. Forgiveness isn't a reward for effort, much less something that can be demanded through achievements or regret. It's the right of those who were left waiting, and it may never come. All Tony had was the present fragile and finite, where he chose to stay in the most persistent way he knew. Staying didn't mean long explanations, didn't mean repeated apologies. It meant steady, quiet, presence without demands. He learned to measure time not by seasons, but by mornings, eating together, afternoons waiting, evenings sitting down to listen without watching the clock. Being a father now didn't carry the look of a hero or a savior. It resembled a patient handcraft, where each day was a small stitch, mending what had frayed. Some days the thread broke, some days the patch didn't align, and some days Tony realized he wasn't allowed to expect anything beyond continuing. Daily atonement wasn't a project with an end point, it was a new rhythm of life, where he accepted that his efforts might never fully compensate for others' memories. The hardest part wasn't doing more, it was bearing the feeling of not being immediately recognized. In sports, effort usually came with measurable results. In family life, effort was sometimes only noted by a silence that felt slightly less heavy than yesterday's. Tony had to relearn patience with things that had no scoreboard. He learned not to turn atonement into a new form of control, not to use presence to demand matching emotions. There were moments he realized he wanted forgiveness faster than others were ready to give, and he had to stop, breathe deeply, and remain in that uncertainty. This was a different kind of discipline not built from fear of being discarded, but from respect for the boundaries of those he loved. Tony also faced what couldn't be fixed in himself. His body still carried the marks of his career, pains reminding him that some prices had been paid in full and couldn't be refunded. But unlike before, he didn't try to conquer them. He learned to live with them, accepting slower days, new limits, and the truth that some mornings he couldn't be the strongest version of himself. Honesty became his only compass. Honesty about what was lost, about what remained, about what couldn't be promised. Tony didn't say everything would be okay. He only said he would be here. And he repeated it through actions, day after day. Sometimes he felt himself standing between two voids, the void of an unfixable past and the void of an unknown future. Between those two voids, persistent presence became a moral choice, not a strategy. There was no guarantee that today's presence would erase yesterday's scratches, no promise that quiet efforts would be repaid. But Tony accepted that uncertainty, because for the first time in his life, he wasn't using endurance to escape, he was using honesty to stay. He realized that complete healing might be too big an expectation, even unfair to those who had been hurt. What he could do was not hurt more, not leave again, and not deny what had happened. Staying with what couldn't be fixed didn't bring a sense of victory, but it brought a fragile kind of peace, where worth was no longer measured by the ability to overcome, but by the ability not to walk away. And in that fragility, Tony Gonzalez learned to live as a late father, a man atoning not with promises, but with steady, honest presence, humble enough to accept that some wounds would last forever, and still needed to be honored as the very lifeblood of love. Tony Gonzalez's legacy doesn't need to be restated through numbers, because the way the next generation plays the game speaks for him. Younger tight ends enter the NFL with bodies trained for both power and speed, with sophisticated route running, with a central role in offensive schemes, all bearing the imprint of a standard Tony set long ago. He sees himself in those movements, in the way they're expected to be both physical and refined, both tough and enduring, and in the look in coaches' eyes when they talk about the Gonzalez standard. But the clearer he sees his influence, the more Tony understands something stats never show. Every record has a price, and that price is often paid with parts of life that can't be measured. Legacy, when viewed from afar, is shining milestones. Legacy, when you stand close enough, is sleepless nights, mornings when the body refuses to cooperate, relationships set aside, and questions no one asks the record setter about what they had to trade away. Tony doesn't deny the pride he feels seeing the next generation play at a higher, safer, smarter level. But he also carries a quiet unease. Will they be taught to listen to their bodies earlier than he was? Or will they learn that lesson too late, through the same kind of pain? Because once a standard is set, it keeps demanding that new people pay the same price, just in different forms. Tony understands that his influence isn't just technique or strategy, it's expectation. And expectation, when not tempered by honesty, can become an invisible pressure that wears people down. He lived long enough inside the cage of the standard to know that being celebrated also means being framed. So, when he talks about legacy, Tony doesn't talk much about glory. He talks about the responsibility to tell the full story. The story that includes the parts that aren't pretty, aren't easy to hear. That, behind every Pro Bowl call, are times the body paid the bill. That behind the remarkable consistency was a brutal recovery schedule. That behind the enduring records were voids in private life that no title could fill. Tony doesn't try to dim his own achievements. He just wants to place them in the proper context of the price paid. Because only when the price is seen can the next generation have the chance to choose differently, choose to stop sooner, listen more, protect what doesn't show up on the stat sheet. Legacy, in the way Tony sees it, isn't about others trying to match how much he endured. It's about them learning they don't have to endure like he did to have worth. That's a legacy that's hard to convey, because it has no beautiful images to promote. But Tony believes that if there's one thing he owes those who come after, it's the truth. The truth that elite sports always demands sacrifice, but not every sacrifice is mandatory. The truth that numbers will outlast the body, but the body is what has to keep living when the lights go out. And the truth that the greatest legacy isn't an unbroken record, it's the ability to help others break records without destroying themselves. Tony stands between two generations. One side is the past that etched itself into him through pain. The other is the future stepping forward with belief and ambition. He doesn't take back what he did, nor does he sugarcoat it. He chooses to say it plainly. The price is real, and it doesn't show up on the stat sheet. If his legacy can do anything better, it's to open an honest conversation about that price, so those who come after don't have to pay with silence, with family voids, with mornings they can't stand up. In that honesty, Tony Gonzalez's legacy stops being a motionless statue and becomes a living reminder that greatness isn't free, and choosing how to pay the price when, with what, and for whom is the hardest part of any great career. Tony Gonzalez entered age 49, not like a victor stepping off the battlefield, but like a man still standing after the battle had taken almost everything it could take. Tony Gonzalez isn't fully healed. His body still carries pains that come and go as a persistent reminder that time doesn't forget any debt. Mornings still require caution. Movements still have to be measured. There's no moment when he can say he's completely at peace. But there are also no longer days when he escapes through practice schedules, through ruthless discipline, through forcing himself to endure just to avoid facing things. The silence around him now is different from the silence of years ago. It's no longer the void of being left behind, nor the loneliness of standing at the top. It's the silence of a man who has looked straight at everything he traded away, and no longer pretends it was all worth the same. At this age, Tony no longer measures life by achievements, nor does he use titles to comfort himself. He understands he didn't win the tragedy. There's no perfect comeback, no moment that closes every wound. The losses are still there. The years that passed don't return. The voids in family life can't be filled just by late presents, and the cracks inside him don't disappear just because he stopped in time. But Tony also no longer runs. No running into busyness. No running into roles. No running into the icon image others need. He stays with the truth, even when that truth doesn't bring relief. Stays with the pain without turning it into a measure of worth. Stays with relationships being mended little by little, even with no guarantee they'll become perfect. Stays with the role of father in the most persistent way he can, not to fully atone, but to never repeat the absence again. Tony learned to keep living with tragedy as part of himself, no embellishing, no denying. He doesn't tell his life story as an inspiring feel-good journey, but as a gentle yet unrelenting warning about the price of turning endurance into identity. There are days he feels he's gone too far to ever go back to being carefree. There are nights he realizes complete peace might be a concept not meant for those who lived too long under pressure. But it's in that incompleteness that Tony finds a different kind of courage. Not the courage to keep enduring, but the courage to stop. To admit he's tired, he's lost, and he's been wrong in many places. Courage to not need a beautiful ending. Courage to accept that real life doesn't run on a win-lose structure. Tony Gonzalez didn't overcome tragedy. He didn't reach the other side, look back, and say everything's fine. He only learned to keep living with it, a little each day, with honesty as his only foundation. And sometimes, living on in that way, not glorious, not redemptive, not hiding, is the most painfully brave form a human being can choose. The story of Tony Gonzalez isn't an epic of triumph, it's a tragedy of the price paid for greatness. And that's exactly what makes it resonate so deeply with the real American experience. We've seen a Tony Gonzalez emerge from a fatherless childhood, where the original tragedy wasn't poverty, it was not being chosen to stay. And from that void, he built discipline like armor to survive. That discipline helped him redefine the tight end position, brought him to the Pro Bowl, All-Pro honors, historic records, but also gradually turned his body into a prison, where chronic pain, arthritis, and mornings he couldn't stand up became the quiet price. More painful still was the tragedy of fatherhood. Tony looked at his children and saw himself as a boy, realizing that absence, whether for career, remains absence. The move to Atlanta wasn't an escape, but an extension of endurance, until the quiet moment he understood that continuing would cost him the ability to be a father, to be a person. Retirement didn't bring peace. It opened an identity void, forcing him to stay with what couldn't be fixed and atone through persistent presence without demanding forgiveness. The lesson for Americans is clear. Society celebrates productivity and toughness, but the stat sheet doesn't record invisible losses. Success isn't free. The price is often paid with body, family, and mental health. Courage isn't just enduring to the end. It's knowing when to stop, listening to the body, and choosing presence for those who need us most. Tony Gonzalez didn't overcome tragedy. He learned to live with it. And in a culture that often confuses winning with human worth, that's the most human and necessary lesson. If the story of Tony Gonzalez makes you pause and reflect on the price of greatness, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue these real journeys behind the spotlight together. Thank you for listening to the very end, and see you in the next video, where we keep exploring stories about people, not just legends,